Oh, yeah. Page up there. Page, I don't need your picture up there or something. How do I get that off of there, Thomas? Yeah, could I get that thing off of there? Oh. I mean, Paige is great, but then you shouldn't be in front of everybody. Maybe
That I have no idea.
sorry, Paige.
I guess height.
Yeah, I do.
Oh,
That's fine.
slightly
That's
better.
fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. Just stick it up there. That's cool. The whole thing is stopped. Oh, that's at least going down. Oh, there we go. It just was slowed down. You guys get a little slower than whatever I say up here. Is that fun yet? Oh, yeah. You sure? My biggest trauma of the entire COVID thing was losing my original lock to my bike. My key, actually. You just can't get them like they used to make them. It's just great. I can do it, it sucks. It's got this whole new technical key that didn't work very well. Very disappointed. Very frustrating.
Did you have to get a new one, or was it just like a copy of it?
No, I had to get a new one. Mine was pretty old.
Same thing with like the car keys that have the buttons on them.
Buttons
Like,
make everything worse.
$300.
Newfangled technology, is it ever better? Is stuff better today than it was before? What do you think?
Depends on what it is.
So what's better, what's not, in your opinion?
I mean, like, if we're talking about cars, like, when there used to be like buttons, like they never broke, and like the dials still work, but now like
They break all the
breaks in,
time.
like 2 years.
Yeah. But the cars get better gas mileage, right? They got better brakes, better safety features.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, when I was a kid, you wouldn't dream of driving 70 miles an hour when other people were driving. I mean, you'd be happy to drive 70 miles an hour by yourself, but you wouldn't want anyone else around, right? Those cars are a little bit unstable. I mean, they were. Okay, let's see what else. What else we got to talk about? Who else got anything novel they want to bring up, talk about? Why is everybody on this side? This is fascinating. It's like I'm gonna be standing like this all class. You guys are all in it. Something wrong? Something you're saying? Oh, yeah, but you can come in this door. It's got the wipes. Everybody wash their hands today? Like dozens of times yet? Is it 2 points? Did I get started?
2:19. You got 30 seconds.
30 seconds. This is as good as it gets in terms of jokes from me. I promise you, it's not going to get any better. These aren't even jokes, right? So it's not going to get better. It's unfortunate for you guys. I feel sorry for you.
Okay, now you're good.
Good entire semester. Okay. All right, what else? One person, just give me something that happened in the energy world to them this week. Anything interesting energy wise? Where's that? I mean, not specifically, where? Why? You have any idea why? Just now, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, maybe.
Yeah. This is pretty good thunderstorm yesterday, I guess, right? Get through and knock some stuff down, okay? Anything else energy wise? Going on out there in the world? Here, how about OSU? Anything good going on at OSU? You guys are totally silent. I'm gonna fix this. I don't know what we're gonna do. I'll
The
figure
energy
something
in
out.
the shoe will be up here in a couple of weeks, I'm sure.
What was that?
The energy in the shoe will be up here in a couple of weeks.
Maybe, I don't know. It looks like they're still trying to sell tickets. They didn't quite sell out yet. You guys all gonna go to the first game? Is it Oregon the first home game? Yeah. Yeah, that'll be interesting. Well, I was down at Appalachian State. I went down there a couple weeks ago. And what I found was really interesting was, just kind of walking around and was looking at their bookstore. And I saw this massive picture. Maybe what the picture was of?
Sure. Michigan, Appalachian State.
Exactly. You know, that year that Appalachian State went up to Michigan, it was like in 2000, whatever, I never what car I know that. I wonder what year that was. It's a long time ago. Yeah, there's apparently there's so many massive pictures of that. Yeah. This guy took a Google or walking at or something. I didn't really pay much attention to it. I just thought it was funny. Guys, you guys. You're not losing, so, yeah. All right, okay. All right, so energy, is this okay? Can everybody see this, all right? Okay. So what we're gonna do now is, so sort of oh God, of course, it's awesome. Thank you.
I think this question might be for the TA, but are you going to unlock this slide on Carmen? Or you can take this one? Yeah, I think this lecture is off.
You mean the slides? I haven't put these slides on Carmen yet. The old slides are on Carmen. They're not that much different.
Okay.
There's
You
a
don't
couple,
We don't have access to it. Like, it's like just locked. Like.
well, that's
Yeah.
stupid. That's my fault. I can do that. He might be able to do it right now because he's also got editor access. So you gotta go, I don't know why that happened. I have no idea. It doesn't make any sense to me. It's published. Is it there? Can you see it?
It's like you can see the link, but every time you click it, it just says locked.
You know what? I discovered these masks. This is related to that. I decided now that just between Washington, I've only been here twice, but I feel like I want to go back to the old days when I smoked. I want to take a smoke break. So I feel like I need a smoke break right now. Just raise the level of tension here. I'm really nervous. I feel like I want to take my mask off and go and have a smoke break and just relieve the tension. I can't do it.
Sorry.
I haven't smoked for like 30 years. That's why
I guess you could still do that if you go outside.
and you can't smoke on campus either. It sucks. It's just like we're all hemmed in. It's like,
Take a long
sheesh.
walk.
Yeah. What are you thinking about this? Masks in the stadium. That's gonna be funny, actually. Are they gonna make everybody vaccinated to go into the stadium? What do you think?
They're gonna make everyone vaccinated anyway.
So next year, though, that'd be interesting to see. I saw that, but I'm just wondering if they're gonna, require for going into the stadium for football games. Fascinating. Okay, anyways, it has nothing to do with energy. We will get that fixed. I promise you, we will. Sorry about that. That's a novel one. I've never actually experienced that before. So we'll get that worked out.
Thank you. Sorry
Okay.
for the pressure.
If he can get it worked out during class, that's awesome. That way we can look at them now. If that ever comes up before class, just let me know. I do have another class, something like for this, I can't actually do anything in that class, but
Still having some problem like what's going on, figuring out, but like kind of just upload to the file.
you can take, you can put the actual one on there. I got it. You can take this if you want. It's your machine.
I can download it on the teacher.
I know, but I'm gonna give you the actual one. You can actually take the PDF of this right off of that. Just don't take my bank account information, which is on there. Okay, any other questions? Anything else? Okay, so sort of roadmap, what we're doing now is today we're just gonna sort of review just general things about the energy sector, to sort of get everybody up to speed, talk a little bit about data stuff. Very little bit about that. And that's basically it for today. Next week, we'll be start talking about demand and how demand influences energy, types of energy, things like that. Then we'll talk about the different sources of energy. Spend a good chunk of time on that for most of the class, or most of the first half of the class. All right. Okay, so that's where we are. So energy and the environment. This is a great picture. You really can't see it. It doesn't come off very well in here, but this was actually taken quite a long time ago. It was just in Wyoming, and you got a little, I guess these are probably actually oil wells. They're storing oil out there. It could be natural gas, I'm not really sure. But what was interesting about the picture, which you can't even see, is the nice little solar panels right in here, right? So this is like 10 years ago. It's an interesting solar panel, right? They're using solar panels to actually run all the stuff related to the electronics related to the oil and gas extraction, which I found kind of interesting, right? So they were even out in Wyoming, they're not so dumb. You might think of a place like that as, no way, we're just gonna, drill, get that oil out of there, but they're not stupid, right? It's pretty hard and crazy to get electrical lines out there and get electricity out there, so why not just use solar power, which is a lot more expensive back then than it is right now, so just kind of fascinating. It's not gonna work. That's not gonna work. That's gonna work. That's great. So the outline is here. Where we get our energy. That's what we're doing today. How fast is our energy consumption growing? Where is it growing? Then we'll talk about some projections, okay? All right, data sources. Oh, see if this works. Okay, so what I'd love to be able to do is just click on these buttons and see if that actually works. I like the fact that Thomas has this mouse here.
So I just uploaded in the folder name August 28th slide.
Okay, so these are on there if you want them, if you're following along.
File name,
Cool.
August 28th slide in the PDF.
Oh, it works. Check that out. Okay, so we're going to use a lot this British Petroleum statistics. They have a great Excel spreadsheet which has an enormous amount of data on it on the world energy sector, on sources of energy going back into the 1960s, sort of the supply of oil, natural gas, coal. They have a whole spreadsheets on or worksheets on renewable energy, supply that in different parts of the world. So it's a really great data source. We're going to use that pretty significantly here at the first part of the class. So I encourage you to go onto their website and grab that data set, that Excel spreadsheet. You can also get it on Carmen. I've already downloaded it and put it on Carmen. Might be locked. I have no idea how that happened, but it could be locked. Hopefully it's not. If it is, let me know and we'll get it fixed. But go to the site and look around because they actually have some pretty interesting stuff. And British Petroleum or BP is a pretty interesting company right now because they are openly claiming that they're transitioning away from petroleum. Right, so their goal is to become basically an energy company that basically supplies people with whatever kinds of energy they want as long as it's clean energy, and they want to get there by say 2040, 2050, right? So they had some of the world's largest and most extensive oil reserves, still have them, but they're basically saying they're going to get rid of them. And you can compare that with one other company, Exxon, which is the biggest oil company out there. And they're basically saying the opposite, right? That they're going to stick with oil for the foreseeable future. And they're not really planning any kind of a transition. So there's a really interesting in the sort of old oil sector, sort of a competition game between these companies. And we'll see which ones are successful, I guess, in 35 or 40 years, right? My guess is both of them probably will be still successful. Just maybe they'll be doing different things. But what you can find interesting about that is that they have this nice energy outlook. And I put a copy of this online as well. It's not a required reading, but I do recommend that if you want to learn a little more about how BP is thinking about the future of the energy sector, have a look at that because, they've got this independent unit that does projections for them of what's happening to the energy sector broadly defined, and what's it going to look like in 25 or 30 years? And then they just write this report about it. And it's that kind of information that someone who is at the top of the company is going to use to say to his or her board of directors, I think we need to transition this company away from oil and into XYZ, right? So it's this kind of information that's really useful for them. And, while I don't expect you will be people who are going to be necessarily writing these kinds of things right out of here, but maybe 15 years from now you might. But what I would hope is that you could go into something like this and look at the things that they say in there. And we'll talk about a few of the bullet points they have. And at the end of this class, you'd be able to evaluate those. Well, you can probably do it right now on your own, but maybe at the end of the class, you'll have some different insights than you would have right now. So that's kind of where we hope to be towards the end of the class. Okay, so we're going to use that. So get ready for that. Another source of information, which is just absolutely amazing, is the U.S. Department of Energy Information Administration. So our government does some really useful things. And one of them is they collect information on the energy sector. Data that is collected by our government, provided to all of us for free, is really what helps make a functioning economy actually work, right? Data is really kind of the most important thing for, economic activity, and having good information is really important, information you can trust. This is some great information. So I really recommend you go to this EIA website and use it, especially if you want to get a job in the energy sector, because this, they keep track of basically everything. And they do a really good job of it. So I definitely recommend, we'll be using that. So from time to time, I'll cite data from that source and we'll go and use some of it in some of the work we do. The International Energy Agency, World Energy Outlook, we'll talk a little bit about that. There's a little bit of a reading from that on the website. Now, the IEA is kind of you got to pay them to get the information. So we won't use that as extensively, but some of their information is there for free. So, it's another place to get some data and information. The point of this is just there is a ton, a boatload of data out there. And, I just really encourage you guys to get good at learning how to access that data and use it yourself to, some positive purpose, right? So don't be afraid of it. It's good stuff. Okay, so trends in energy consumption. Where are we? This is interesting. Updated these, and what happened last year is pretty pronounced there in terms of reductions in energy consumption in some places. So I at this point just divided it into 4 different places in general. So the US, Europe, China, and the rest of the world. Okay. A couple of slides later, I added India as a separate place because it's a big chunk of the world's population. Just see what's going on there. Here you see what's really happening out there is what is that in terms of total energy consumption, the wealthier parts of the world are pretty stable in terms of their energy consumption. Consume a lot, but they're pretty stable and actually declining in terms of energy consumption, in terms of the trends in the last 10 years. The big increases are happening in China, which is really the biggest consumer and growing consumer of energy globally. Rest of the world really growing rapidly as well, but not quite as rapidly. I was kind of surprised, what's interesting is that in China last year with the pandemic, their total energy consumption didn't decline at all, whereas up there in the ROW did decline, right? So you can start to see, some of the results of the pandemic and how it would play out on individuals around the world that, this rest of the world is significantly poorer, right, than anyone in this, obviously there's lots of people who are not wealthy in the US, Europe, and China, but just on average, incomes are significantly lower in the rest of the world. And that was hit pretty hard, obviously, with the pandemic, both economically and by the pandemic. So you can kind of see that in the data. We didn't have sort of as big of decreases here as in other parts of the world, but yeah, we had some decreases, obviously, in terms of the amount of energy. And we'll see where that was. That was mostly in oil consumption. Next question. Yeah, look at that. Okay, so the numbers are in exajoules, all right? So I kind of jump back and forth a little bit between millions of tons of oil equivalent and exajoules. These are just units of measure of energy. And so what is an exajoule? An exajoule is it's like a kilowatt hour, it's the unit of energy that we use. Bruce will actually give you a much more better definition of these things later. For our purposes, just imagine it as a unit you could buy, right? Although an exajoule is a massive unit you could buy, it's a billion joules. A typical house in Ohio uses 39 billion joules per year. Ooh, that seems like a lot, huh? So a joule must be really small, right? Typical driver in Ohio uses 9 billion joules a year. So that means that one exajoule would power 1.7 years of Ohio driving. That's for everybody in Ohio, actually, right? So we're talking really big numbers here. We're talking exajoules, right? Or an exajoule could power 6 years of Ohio household electricity. We, on average, consume about 10,000 kilowatts per hour for the typical 2,500 to 3,500 square foot house in Ohio. Okay, so that's kind of what an exajoule is. So it's just a unit of measure. We're using such a big number because it makes it easy to put on a graph, right? Okay, so this is also an exajoules. This is global energy consumption by fuel. So what kinds of fuels are we using? So no longer looking at it by where is it consumed, but more looking at it as what kind of fuel we're consuming. It's oil's the big one, right? Oil's the predominant one. Natural gas, or I should say coal is the second biggest one, and then natural gas. So the top three are what? Fossil fuels, right? Oil is used mainly for what? What do we use oil mainly for? Okay, for transportation, right? For moving around. And what else?
Raw materials.
Raw material.
Plastic.
Plastic. Okay, so most of our plastics are made out of oil. Okay. What else? Anything else?
Heating and cooling.
What was that?
Heating and cooling.
So, yeah, there are pockets of the US, particularly the northeastern US, where they use oil for heating, not so much for cooling, but for heating. There are different parts of the world where there's oil that is used for electricity production, actually. So some places, this is oil that you would never use for anything else. It's kind of leftover oil, the junk that gets used for heating. Venezuela uses a lot of it, Guyana uses a lot of it. So places that have oil sort of close to them, we use these things called bunker fuels. I think you could ask Bruce, there's a couple, there might be one left. These quote unquote bunker fuels, these oil fired sort of electric plants for heating or for electricity. Those things, there's still at least one of them in Ohio, right? And they just use it for peaking power, like in the middle of summer, like right now when it's really hot. And everybody gets their air conditioner on. You just need a little bit more electricity to get onto the grid. You'll sort of bring these things out of the closet, throw a little oil in them, and turn them on, and make a little money on them, right? But you only use them once a year, every 5 years or 10 years, something like that. Okay, so oil, the big one. Natural gas or coal, still pretty big. It's starting to fall, as we'll talk about. That's actually, the big projection on that is going to fall quite a lot. Natural gas been growing a lot recently. You can see with the pandemic, what really happened was that transportation sort of went off a cliff, right? People quit moving around for quite a long time. Airline traffic really went down a lot. Ship transportation kind of slowed down pretty dramatically. So the demand for and consumption of oil declined pretty dramatically. Imagine if you're in that sector, right? I mean, I would imagine that if you were in the oil sector, that last couple of years, was a pretty exciting time. If you still had a job, it'd be a pretty exciting time to be in the oil sector. Maybe not a great time, but there'd be a lot of stuff going on, and it'd be pretty interesting. As you'll see, well, you can see right there. I mean, what happened here, right? So oil went down there. Do anyone remember what happened there? You guys all like the oil back taxes? Yeah, so part of that was the oil crises, and so this sort of whole two time periods were these oil crises in the 1970s, right? Sort of precipitated by the Arab-Israeli War in 1973 and OPEC's embargo of oil exports to the U.S. and its allies around that time. And then the Iranian crisis in 1979 really what precipitated this big reduction. But that was a huge reduction in oil consumption globally at that point in time, but nothing like what we just experienced recently, right? So, I mean, literally, you guys, just lived through a time that is pretty defining, I think, for all of us, for a lot of different reasons, but in the energy sector as well as, health-wise and everything else. Of course, renewables are growing pretty dramatically. That's awesome, right? Nuclear staying pretty stable, hydro growing just sort of bit by bit, right? A little bit at a time. Okay, exciting. Okay, what is the world's energy mix? So taking this and flipping it, looking at,
Oh, how do you explain the the dramatic increase in coal from I guess that's 2000 to 2006? Is that the US? Is that after the Soviet Union fall or what? Specifically from 2000 to 2006, it kind of grew much faster than the general trend.
It's probably China, because they're the number one coal.
yeah, so that's right. So China explains this big increase right here over time. In a lot of the statistics, you'll see that, right? That in fact, China, because of this massive economic growth that happened after they joined the World Trade Organization in 2000, precipitated not only a big increase in income, but a huge increase in the amount of coal that was consumed, because that was the main energy source that they used to power pretty much heavy industry, right? Now they're pivoting away from that now, and we're starting to see a slowdown in that. I mean, so this would actually still be going up if it wasn't for the fact that Europe and the US, Australia a little bit, New Zealand for sure, where Japan would want to reduce their coal production, and they are reducing it, or consumption, but they also have this issue with the tsunami that created a big problem in the Fukushima power plant, right? So they had to get rid of all of their nuclear power pretty quickly, which meant that they kept coal online for a little bit longer. So they've been less a part of that, but this would keep growing if it wasn't for the fact that many countries were actually slowing down their consumption of coal in the last decade or two. Okay, so yeah, that's good. So yeah, I love that. Always look at these pictures and ask questions about why things happen. I like that. This is also the renewables is going up, and that is as we'll see. It's a nice global phenomenon actually. There's a few places where it's happening a little bit more than other places, but it's a reasonably global phenomenon. So that's actually a nice thing. Okay, so the energy mix today, and then a projection of what it's going to be in the future. So what you can see right now is about 32% of the energy in the world comes from oil, 25% natural gas, 27% coal. Then renewables are what, 6%? Hydro 7%, nuclear 4%, right? And then this BP outlook suggests that, well, we're still going to have a lot of these things, a lot of the dirty ones. It's unfortunate that their baseline projection without any new policies suggests we're still going to have a lot of that stuff in the future, but we'll have a lot more renewables. So that's a good thing, right? So this BP projection is maybe a little not so optimistic. We'll talk about why just in a little bit. Yep.
Why is natural gas not more of the energy mix and less coal, especially with the US increasing natural gas production? Why isn't it more natural gas and less coal?
Okay, so one thing to keep in mind is it's 2050, so there's actually a lot more energy consumed out then, right? So in fact, actually, there is a lot more natural gas consumed, just proportionally it's smaller, right? So there is a lot more natural gas consumed in the future. But it's a good question, is why is there still coal consumed at all, right? And so one reason is coal is really cheap, actually. Getting out of the ground is pretty cheap. Natural gas is more expensive to get out of the ground. Even with hydraulic fracturing in the US, natural gas is still, or coal is still cheaper to get out of the ground in many places in the world. And our supplies of it are enormous, right? It's the biggest sort of supply source that we have, or at least know about. So it helps keep it relatively low cost. In terms of natural gas, as we'll find out. And you know what? These projections are all based on sort of what we kind of understand about technologies today and how we think they might evolve in the future. Natural gas is really interesting because, how do you ship it around, right? So the main way it goes from place to place is by pipeline. And we're discovering we can liquefy it, stick it on a ship and move it from place to place as well. But these LNG ports are pretty extensive technologies that are actually kind of dangerous, and you can't really put them everywhere. You can't put them close to people. If they blow up, it really causes problems. So there's lots of difficulties of moving natural gas across oceans, actually. No difficulty with coal, stick it on a ship and send it, right? And it's a really compact sort of energy source. So coal is something that's just almost easier to work with, right? And move from place to like oil, right? So that's another reason, actually. Although we might be moving around some of those natural gas limitations with the LNG technologies that are coming on board. Anyways, there you go. That's projections. Oof. Okay, so this is kind of energy consumption in these different places: the U.S., Europe, rest of the world, and China. And you can start to get a flavor for what are the sources of energy in these different places. Obviously, the U.S. Gotten really heavy in natural gas and moving on down. I mean, this class has changed a lot in the 10 years I've been teaching it. This was a lot more coal, right? This was more like 35% coal, even just 5 or 6 years ago. I mean, this is an enormous change. I mean, you guys are living through this energy transition, right? And it's pretty phenomenal what's happening. Things were stable since, I mean, so in the 70s, there was just complete mess up, right? The energy sector was all over the place. But between 1980 and 2012, I mean, it was pretty stable where we got our energy from. And all of a sudden, it's just gone AWOL here. Yeah, it's probably all pretty good, but it's just interesting, right? So we're going through this transition. Renewables are really nothing, but they've gone quite a lot actually in the US. You know, Europe, you can see similar, right? And they've almost gone through the same transition. They were pretty heavy into coal for a long time. You know, Germany, for all of its great environmentalism, right? I mean, Germany's known for having all these great solar panels and everything like that. What's Germany's big issue right now? Anyone know? Anyone pay attention to Germany? Yeah.
Didn't they have some bad floods recently?
Yeah, so it has some bad floods, a month ago, something like that. Similar situation, like we just had these floods in Tennessee, right? Real bad floods in Tennessee, similar situation, I think, right? Where it was pretty dramatic and pretty quick. But on the energy sector, what's going on in Germany? It's fascinating. So Germany, like a couple of other European countries, has decided that they don't want to do nuclear power anymore. And nuclear was, I don't know, 10% of their energy. So this has created a big sort of conundrum for the Germans, because I think it's within the next year that they're getting rid of all these nuclear power plants. But in order to get rid of these nuclear power plants, Germany has to do what? Yep. So they have to replace the energy. So what are they replacing it with? So they're actually replacing some of it with coal, right? So they're actually going to be increasing just for a little bit, and for a short period of time, say the Germans, I have no idea how long, but just for a short period of time, they're going to have to increase their coal consumption because they don't have enough of the renewables, and the renewables, you know, aren't on all the time. Yeah.
Was it just public fear? Why do you know why they stopped doing nuclear?
Yeah. So, you know, in Europe was a lot closer to Chernobyl. Chernobyl was a long time ago, right? 1986. You guys all saw the 4-part series on that, right? Which was fantastic, actually. Yeah, so that had a huge impact. And then Fukushima was another thing that kind of put the sword in a little deeper on nuclear power in Germany, Sweden as well. So yeah, the Europeans were wanting to move away from. Now the European countries don't worry about it, like France, you know, they're gung ho on nuclear. It don't seem to, and probably won't get rid of it for any time in the near future. Same question.
Similar question, but also like, what's holding nuclear back from becoming safer or more efficient?
Well, I think that's a great question. That it might be a better question for Bruce. Yeah, I think we would have different opinions on it. So one thing we know is there's an enormous amount of nuclear going online in China right now. So there are parts of the world where nuclear is actually increasing dramatically. The US is not increasing, obviously. We're kind of going in that direction. I think there's one nuclear power plant slated to go online in the next couple of years down in Georgia, I think. So, it's very country specific. So the US, and if you look at the cost, so we'll look at the Lazard's levelized cost of electricity data for the US. And it's pretty interesting to look at what the levelized cost of existing nuclear power plants, right? There's two of them in Ohio, up on Lake Erie. I mean, one in Ohio, one in Michigan, anyway, we have two of them that produce electricity for Ohio. Which were obviously part of this big thing with HB6 and whatnot. But those actually have really low costs because they were built a long time ago. And keeping them running is not actually that expensive compared to building a new power plant. But Lazar's has some pretty interesting statistics on what does it cost to put a new nuclear power plant in place in the US. It's extremely expensive with the regulatory controls that we have. Those regulatory controls don't exist in China, right? They don't have the same sets of concerns. Of course, we had our own incident at 3 Mile Island, in 1983, something like that. So, we have our own experiences with that, which has driven to some extent the, public concern with nuclear power and driven the regulatory regime to be pretty strict with it, right? It drives up costs pretty dramatically. So, it's expensive to put in new nuclear power, but that's very place specific. It's like it's coal. Coal is, you'll see that on the levelized cost thing to look at too, is that coal without regulations is exceedingly cheap to produce electricity, right? Even though it's less efficient to burn coal and create electricity than natural gas, coal, because it's just cheaper to get out of the ground and there's so much of it, is cheap. And so if you have no environmental restrictions on it, then it's the cheapest thing you can use. So you can imagine if you're a country like, like China or now India, and you have access to coal in your own boundaries, then it's relatively cheap. That's what you're going to use. Nuclear in those places as well is a little bit cheaper. I think the margin is just a little more expensive than natural gas. But when you add in the regulatory controls we have, that's what makes the big difference. Yeah. Okay, so China, much more obviously, much more coal, less natural gas, reducing our oil and growing renewables. Rest of the world, looks more kind of like the US, in Europe. A lot less renewables there. Okay, so who has all the energy? Who has it? I'm gonna say, who has the energy? Yeah.
Well, based on the meeting right now, if we're talking about the US, we have a lot of natural gas and oil, especially with the shale revolution, and we're starting to build more, wind turbines and solar power, especially in the West. But we also do offshore stuff in the Gulf of Mexico, and I guess we import it from China sometimes, and the Middle East, depending on the markets. But that's kind of just the US.
Okay, so US has a lot. We do actually. Turns out we have an enormous amount. Correct. Who else?
You talking about countries or?
Yeah, countries, continents.
Canada?
Canada, it's crazy Canadians. They got a lot of all kinds of energy up there. A lot of natural gas, a lot of oil. Not so much coal, actually, but some. Yeah.
A current issue, in regards to this, is that the territory that the Taliban is occupying has a lot of natural resources, and some of which the United States uses. So there's actually been talks with high-ranking Taliban members.
So what kinds of energy do they have specifically?
They
It's
have-
an interesting thing, isn't it?
Yeah, they have, I think they have a couple oil reserves. They just have a lot of natural resources because of that area geography that the world is dependent on.
Yeah, so it's an interesting thing, yeah.
Aren't the big three Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the US?
Okay, Russia and Saudi Arabia, let's come back to that in just a second though. The Afghanistan thing is super interesting because turns out they got a lot of these rare earths, right? Which is what are used to create batteries for, to power the new generation in the world, right? So actually, that's an interesting thing. They have a big chunk of the supply apparently of rare earths, and these are some of the most important minerals that we never used to think of. If you look at the BP, so the BP thing has a whole worksheet on rare earths and lithium and whatnot. They didn't have that 5 years ago even, right? because no one was thinking about that as a sort of source of energy, even though it's not energy itself, but it's a critical component in the energy sector now, right? So, yeah, that's an interesting one. So a place like that, you know, and what do we know about, so we'll get back to that in just a second. Well, actually, there's a good example. So two other places, Saudi Arabia and Russia, are two places that have significant energy reserves, right? So what do we know about the typical place with a big chunk of energy? How has their economic development been?
The resources.
Yeah, I mean, how do resources interplay with economic development? Do they tend to have, you know, high income per capita?
No. So a lot of like countries that have a lot of like really good resources are like the most underdeveloped countries like on the planet. Like the
Yeah, so there's this resource curse often that
Yeah.
we think about or talk about, or you might hear about, right? That in many places that have high levels of amounts of energy, right? It seems like there's a curse that it's difficult for them to experience, you know, sustained economic growth, right? And usually the economic growth, well, there's two things about the economic growth in many places that have lots of energy. One is the economic growth usually just goes to a relatively small proportion of the population, right? That's true and true across the whole world now, but in particular in places that have high energy, that's true, that there's a huge disparity between those who have a lot of income and those who don't. And, you know, the second thing is it's tied to, you know, the cyclical, right? The cyclical nature, that is, they grow great when energy prices are high, and then they don't grow at all, and they actually experience massive retractions in economic growth when prices are low and they fall. So, yeah, so this resource curse is a big issue, right? And so Afghanistan, you just think of that as a place that's, you know, massively underdeveloped in terms of economic growth historically. And it's super unfortunate, right? They have this resource and who knows if it'll benefit anyone there, you know? Yeah,
Also, a lot of these like underdeveloped countries, once they discover a new source of energy, they tend to have foreign intervention from superpowers like the United States that kind of prevent that growth as well.
there's, I didn't hear the whole part of what you said. Sorry about that. Can you just repeat that?
Oh, yeah. Some of these countries that discover like a new source of energy, that tends to open them up to like foreign intervention from current superpowers like the United States that kind of prevent that economic growth.
Yeah, it's interesting. So you think of like Afghanistan, which has been perpetually sort of, well, not perpetually, but first it was the Brits, then it was the Russians, right, who sort of spent a lot of time there. So, yeah, I mean, this often happens, right? That if you have really valuable resources, then other people actually want it, right? And if they have more power than you, then sometimes they'll just come and get them. That's certainly accurate. Yeah. Okay, so resource curse is good. So who has the energy? So it turns out energy is really pretty broadly distributed. But different people have different chunks of different kinds of energy, all right? So let's sort of talk through the different sources of energy and sort of work through each of them and talk about what are some of the factors that drive who has them and who doesn't. We'll start with oil and then go through coal, natural gas, or renewables. You only got 40 minutes left, isn't that great? Yeah, I meant to say earlier, you know, if anyone wants to take a break, you're welcome. I'm not gonna take a break. I'm just gonna keep going for the whole time. Some classes are gonna be just lecture oriented, this one is. Some classes are gonna be a lot more interactive, I promise you. But if you need to just get up and leave, go take a break, go do whatever you wanna do, that's just cool, but not gonna bother me, all right? Okay, you gotta go early, just get on out of here, it doesn't matter. If you wanna come in late, that's fine too. My favorite ever class was, what was the dude's name? I forget his name. But he was as tall as this, and he was enormous. And it was in another room, which room was it? And, you know, I'm just sitting there, you know, talking, it's 15 minutes into class, and talking, and I can't remember his name. Comes walking into class, and just walks up right behind me, feels this massive hulk of a person behind me. This kind of scares the crap out of me. I'm just like, what? And he says, just pats me on the head and says, "What's up, prof?" And just walks and sits down. It's really pretty funny, actually. Anyways, whatever. I'm gonna try to make jokes once in a while, okay? But you guys are feel free to laugh or not, it's okay. Okay, so oil, what do we got? Production side, so production up here and consumption down here. Kind of show this because why? Because in oil, it's an easy thing to move around. We are talking about that earlier. And so therefore, we have moved it around the world a lot. So the places that have it versus the places that consume it has not always been the same over time, right? And that's a really important part of the oil market in particular. Okay, so oil production, no, I changed the color scheme. Black is rest of the world, blue, US, green, Europe, China. I guess I don't have India separated out on this one, on the next slide or something. All right, so, the rest of the world is consuming most of the oil. It's a big chunk of people out there, so it kind of makes sense there, right? This is production, sorry. Let's start with consumption. Same color scheme, though, that's good. Right, so the rest of the world is consuming most of the oil. See, that's why I was confused. I was thinking the US is supposed to be up there for what I knew. So the US is pretty high in terms of consumption of oil. Europe about the same. Europe has more people than the US, so their sort of per capita consumption obviously is a lot smaller than ours on average. But you can see, kind of like we saw with coal, big increase in China in terms of consumption in the last this is the mid-1990s, right? And you can kind of immediately, these are two different scales, but you can kind of immediately see the big difference between sort of production and consumption, right? So massive production in the rest of the world, not as much consumption, right? So there's big parts of the world that are producing a lot of oil and shipping it off to somewhere else that's consuming it. And the US, obviously a lot more consumption for most of the time than its production. But recently we've managed to boost our production up through hydraulic fracturing or fracking pretty significantly, right? Europe kind of got a boost here for a time. This was a big thing when we talk about climate change in Europe, and we ask why has Europe been so much, look like they've been so much more successful than the US at climate mitigation. Well, a lot of it has to do with this bump right here. So what happened was in the 1970s, Great Britain and Norway discovered a massive amount of oil and natural gas in the North Sea. And you can see it in terms of oil production. So Europe became a pretty big oil producer for some period of time, right? It's that discovery has kind of played out now and it's started to decline in terms of its total production levels. But for a period of time, they really increased production pretty dramatically, right? In that part of the world, and they managed to almost produce the same amount as they consumed, but not quite. In Europe, that's driven by one place, and it's always an interest. That's an even more interesting conundrum, right? Is Norway, right? What do you think of when you think of Norway? You would think of Norway. You ever think of Norway? You guys ever think of Norway?
Fjords, right?
Fjords, yeah. Okay, they got some nice scenery. What else?
Glaciers?
What was that?
What about that education system?
A good what system?
Education.
They're smart. Okay, they're smart.
A lot of government programs.
A lot of government programs are smart. They got government programs that pay them to sit around and do nothing. They take big vacations, right? I mean, it's cold, but since none of them actually live there in the winter, they don't give a crap because they all go to the Azores in the winter. Yeah, right, not bad. Okay, what else?
High life expectancy. Like happiness.
Yeah, if you got 6 months off a year and the government paid for it, would you have a pretty high life expectancy too? I would.
Depends on what you're doing during those 6 months, but yeah.
Yeah, they're skiing in the winter and I don't know, on the beach in the summer, I guess. I don't know. Be awesome. What else? Electric cars? I mean, come on, what about electric cars? I mean, it's like 75 or 85% of the new cars sold in Norway these days are either hybrid or electric, right? Pretty phenomenal. Are they carbon neutral? Oh my God, they're way beyond carbon neutral. Heck yeah. They're hydropower, right? You don't have to worry about all that stuff. What else? How about the forests? How about the rainforest? Do they help the rainforest out? Yeah, I mean, they're paying Indonesia, Brazil, Guyana billions of dollars to stop cutting down trees. And where are they getting the money from? Where are they getting the money from? They sucked it out of the ground, right? They just, this whole thing, man, look at, Norway's awesome. This is what they suck all that oil out of the ground. They benefited from massively high prices, actually, not too long ago, for oil, right? And took all that money and did what? I mean, this is the part that none of the rest of us could accomplish. This is what makes it unique, right? So what will we do in the US? Oh, we did do it, actually. What did the US do with all the money that we got from hydraulic fracturing and high oil prices? What do we do with it?
But it includes like manufacturing and like
Maybe.
building cities,
Maybe.
all the other million expenditures.
Well, we don't have very high taxes. We didn't, the government didn't get very much of it. Yeah, but,
They put it back into oil,
okay, some of it went back into oil exploration, some of it went where?
into stocks.
Stocks, went into other kinds of businesses, right? Yeah. Yeah. People benefited, some people got jobs, some people had stock in the company and did really well, right? So, you know, we kind of dispersed that money out, actually, right? This isn't a bad thing necessarily about the US. It's just imagine this being Norway and, you know, having this all happen in the ocean where you actually control it as a government, right? So you get the rents off of it, you get the money off of it, and then you as the government do what? You're making all this money. They have this massive sovereign wealth fund, right? Which is, we have what's the debt now in the US, $26 trillion. So we have a debt, that's a debt that's the size, almost a deficit, but the debt is bigger than our annual income, right? Well, they have a sovereign wealth fund, which is the other side of the debt, right? This is just a big asset that they have, which is like 3 or 4 times the size of their annual income, right? And they just use it for good stuff, like, you know, subsidizing electric cars, paying for raincoats. I mean, it's kind of cool. I mean, I don't know that we would be able, we couldn't accomplish that politically in the US, but it's interesting that some countries can, right? Yeah.
Is there like oil business privatized or is it like government?
Well, interesting, yeah. So no, it's mostly with private companies that did the extraction. Okay, so, you know, almost all places, and this is true in the US as well, in almost all places, the resources under the ground are technically owned by the government. Okay. So governments are allowed to tax them when they come out of the ground, right? But here in the US, the government's like, you know, that's ours, but you know, anyone can go down there and extract it. And if you extract it, I can tax you for it. I can't really stop you from extracting it. So it's not really like the government owns it, but they're allowed to tax you for it if they want. But it's private companies that then are incentivized to go and pull it out of the ground, right? And in the North Sea, that was basically the seabed was government land, and it wasn't owned by individuals. So the government basically just had leases like we do in the Gulf of Mexico, and they just sold leases to companies to go out and extract the oil and the natural gas. And you know, they just made, you know, the government made money on basically on those leases. So it's just a different model, but it's fascinating, you know, what's happened out of, you know, that sort of bump right there, what came out of that later on. Okay, oil consumption per capita, kind of biggest here, kind of growing in Latin America, pretty big here in the Middle East where a lot of oil is produced, but also in the northern countries. So it's interesting, in the northern countries, it takes a lot more energy to sort of exist in northern countries, and so income or consumption per capita for most energy components is kind of higher. Other reasons for it are that, you know, places like Russia and Canada in particular are pretty spread out. So in order to get from place to place, you have to use transportation. It's pretty oil intensive. Where are the resources in terms of proved reserves? So this kind of shows by region: Middle East in orange, South Central America in green, North America in lighter green. CIS is the Commonwealth of Independent States. So that's a set of countries that were originally part of the USSR. If you remember that, that was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, former Russia, but then when that broke up in 1991, the CIS, kind of like Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, et cetera, right? So these places have an enormous actual oil reserves as well. So the biggest ones are in the Middle East. Those are also the cheapest ones to get. Second biggest ones are in South and Central America. Propelled by recently, this is why it's kind of grown over time or stayed pretty big, propelled by big finds off the shore of Brazil, really deep, like 45,000 feet. Just imagine that. Most of you have flown in a plane, I assume, right? So just think about that. When you're flying, you're in a plane at 35,000 feet, right? Just imagine that these guys are drilling a well that far down from your plane to the ground, right? It's pretty phenomenal if you think about it. There's also a huge find of oil in Guyana, which is one of the poorest countries in South America. And there's great hope that they may benefit out of that finally. But of course, it's at a time when we really shouldn't be using oil. Africa is in red, Asia Pacific, and Europe. So what you can immediately see from this is what Asia Pacific, which includes, China, has really small reserves, right? And remember that picture that showed their increases in consumption. So, places in Asia where there's enormous increases in demand have pretty low proved reserves. Okay. So oil is an interesting thing because it's kind of distributed in certain places. And we'll find out that costs matter a lot for this as well. But it's distributed in certain places and then consumed in other places. Now, definition, important definition, because we use the term a lot, proved reserves. Okay, what is proved reserves? Proved reserves is the estimated quantity of oil which geological and engineering data demonstrate reasonable certainty, blah, 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 recoverable under current economic and operating conditions. Okay, so first off, this concept of in place. So that's the geologists going out with their bombs that they drill in the ground and blow up and then observe how the waves, the shock waves from a bomb going off at the ground. They observe how those waves move, and they can detect where they think there's going to be pockets of oil and natural gas. So they're going to use those techniques to sort of figure out where are these resources, and those are going to be called in place, right? Okay, then once they've done that, they're going to come along and ask the question, okay, do we have a technology today that can extract this stuff? All right, and they'll sort of create another line, which is the technologically feasible stuff. So there's the amount that they know is there, and then there's the amount that's technically feasible, and then there's economically feasible. And economic obviously is going to sort of shift over time depending on prices, right? So, technically feasible, there's lots of things that may be technically feasible. However, it might be too expensive to actually operate that technology under current prices, right? So economically feasible would be the one, or economically recoverable would be the line that speaks to what's the cost, what's the price, and is it enough money to get you to actually invest in drilling that well, okay? So what we really care about are these economically recoverable stocks, right? Yeah.
So when people talk about like proved reserves, they're really only looking at like the far left curve.
Correct.
So there's really just like way more oil out there than like people say it is.
Yeah. Yeah, so the sad thing is, and this is really sad, I mean, you have to think of the drama, right? And I mean, what we now know is that there is so much oil out there that, I mean, like a decade ago, we're all worried about running out. I mean, literally, people were worried about running out. There were people running around campus worried about peak oil and the fact that it was really more on the other side. It was going to disappear within a decade with having more oil. But now we know that there's so much out there that we could live forever with plenty of oil for 5 billion people, not just for 5 billion additional people, I should say, not just for the 7 we already have, right? The sad thing is that now we know we shouldn't use it, right? It's like the cookie jar, the kid with the cookie jar, I mean, seriously, it sucks. Yeah. Yeah,
You mentioned earlier about like Exxon and like there's like, like they said, they're still gonna stick with oil. Have they mentioned anything about like trying to figure out how to like make the oil like, cleaner in the way they refine it or the way
yeah,
comes out?
that's a huge thing in the oil sector right now, is exactly that. So I'll introduce some pictures, not to this section, but a little later to talk about that. It's what's the carbon content of oil, right? So the same way we're asking about what's the carbon content of just about anything, right? There's a big effort to sort of think through supply chains, right? Exactly that. It's what's the carbon content of oil. So what we know is that stuff in Canada has super high levels of tons of carbon dioxide emitted per like joule of energy or something like that, right? And the stuff in the Middle East is really low in terms of that because it's so high and close to the surface. And then, you know, these companies add to that the idea that, okay, you know, this is with Exxon's proposal, and, you know, Bruce talks a little bit about it, is that the idea of carbon capture and storage. So if you have a refining facility, which is an energy intensive process, uses a lot of heat, creates a lot of emission when you actually refine oil. So not only is the oil itself, you know, creating an emission when you burn it, but the refining of it, going from oil to petroleum to kerosene to jet fuel, et cetera, that's also an energy intensive process. But if they can at least take the carbon dioxide and then from that, capture it and stick it underground, that reduces the carbon intensity of, you know, of that oil source, right? So there is a huge effort, and Exxon's involved in that for sure, right? Of trying to figure out ways to push the energy intensity of, or I should say, the carbon intensity of their oil to a lower level, as is every oil company.
So real quick, based on that graph, is there like a kind of sweet spot where you would want to like, you know, extract, like, is it like 75%, 80%? Like, you don't want to be too safe, but also like not like based on that graph, where
Well-
people most fall.
Yeah, so what we know is that as long as prices stay high enough, the oil companies will extract all of the economically recoverable oil.
Even if it's like 5%.
Well, they're not gonna get the last 5%, but most of it.
Okay.
Yeah. And, you know, one of the technologies for carbon capture and storage is enhanced oil recovery, which is taking carbon dioxide and shooting it down into oil wells, right? So when oil prices get really high, the stuff that has, you know, low probability, right, of getting out under any given price, as prices go up, it has a higher and higher probability. That entire curve actually shifts because in fact, actually, all of a sudden, what happens when prices go up? You know, somebody says, I'm gonna extract a little bit more oil from that well. I'll spend the money with one of these enhanced oil recovery techniques to try to get that last little bit out. Okay, so you know, this is kind of like a static picture. I think it tells the story well enough of, you know, the idea of what we're interested in is economically proved reserves. It's kind of the green line, but we know about all this other stuff as well, right? But what we'll talk about mostly in this class, and when we look at the data in the BP spreadsheet, is talking about the green line. But even then, those lines, they're kind of fluid. It depends a little bit on price, a lot on price actually, which is moving around a lot actually in the oil sector, as we'll see, right? So it's nice to have on a graph like that, but of course the real world's not perfect like that. Okay, so just the definition. So when you see proved reserves, you know, and so here's the U.S. Interesting situation in the U.S. So production and proved reserves. You know, U.S. is one of those places that has seen a dramatic increase in proved reserves in the last couple of decades. So, you know, this is a good example of proved reserves. So a place where these proved reserves increased in the U.S., 3 places. Well, Texas, there were 3 basins in Texas, and the Williston Basin, or Bakken in North Dakota, are the places where we have massive increases in proved reserves here. So these proved reserves increased because of 2 factors. The first factor was the technology. So through technological improvements of hydraulic fracturing or fracking, suddenly what we knew to be in-place resources, and we knew about it way back in the sixties and fifties, right? So people knew North Dakota was an oil, sitting on a massive oil reservoir 75 or 80 years ago, right? But they couldn't get it. It just, they didn't have the technology for it. They knew that the Eagle Ford and the Permian Basin in Texas were both places where there was a lot of oil left after they had extracted the easy stuff on top. But they didn't know how to get to it, right? All of a sudden, this technology came about that allowed, and you read about that in the book, that allowed them to access that. And suddenly those proved reserves or those in-place reserves became technically efficient. And then you can't really see the numbers, but here, in 2010 to 2015, we saw massive increases in oil prices. And that further shot these reserves up, right? Because all of a sudden, these things that were kind of expensive weren't expensive relative to the price anymore. Okay, so the US had this massive increase in proved reserves, and of course, production here went up dramatically. US is a fascinating place. It turns out we're the biggest oil producer now in the world, but we don't have the biggest reserves, right? We've got actually pretty small reserves compared to the Middle East, Canada, and Venezuela. But because, we have a super efficient economy with a super efficient oil sector, we're able to translate those proved reserves into production, really quickly. And we're gonna run the experiment now. There's a lot of people who sort of theorize that these large sort of price shocks of the past with hydraulic fracturing would no longer be as important. So Bruce will talk about this issue of, what creates these big cycles, these big price cycles, right? So one of the things that creates them is the capital investment you need to produce oil or produce gas or produce coal. It turns out that oil historically has been a massively capital intensive business. So through all of this time and going way back to here, if you wanted to produce oil, it was a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. So if you wanted to install a new project in the Gulf of Mexico or Tajikistan or in Russia or wherever, through British Petroleum or Exxon, you had to raise $1 billion in capital, all right, for any new oil field that come online, right? If you're a hydraulic fracturer, you want to put in a hydraulic frac pad, it's a couple $1 million, right? So all of a sudden, you don't have to be a massive oil company to produce oil. You can be a mid-sized or small company and go out and get the technology and pretty easily go out and find a place to do the fracking, okay? So, the theory was, and there is still, that, we tried this sort of new technology, all of a sudden, we're not going to have these big price cycles because, what happens? Okay, so here's the newest one is Exxon has invested, $1.5 billion in Guyana, in this field off the shore of Guyana. It's pretty deep. It's like 47,000 feet under the surface of the sea, right? So it's really deep. It's an expensive, big technology project to get stuff out of there, right? They've drilled the hole. They got the hole open. It really doesn't matter what the price is now. They're just going to keep pumping that oil out, right? Because they've already spent the money to get that well built. Okay. So it's just going to keep coming out, even if prices go down pretty low. So you can start to understand why these cycles happen. Prices are high, companies can raise the capital, they can put in $1 billion into building a couple of these things. When prices go down, well, they really can't stop. It's a sunk cost, yeah, but they're not actually spending a whole lot of money to keep the thing going. Okay, so they can just keep pumping this stuff out, throwing it on the market, even though prices are low. As long as there's, we'll talk about, as long as there are variable costs of annual labor, pumping the stuff around place to place is met, they can still do it, right? So that creates these sort of up and down cycles, but we may be out of that. Yeah.
When the prices of gas and oil go up, does that increase production like other goods and services do? Like if a hot dog costs $7, like for the consumer, people are gonna make more hot dogs. It's like when the price of oil goes up, does that actually increase production at all, or are those not related?
Yes, when the price of oil goes up, it induces people to enter the market and increase the amount of oil production that happens for sure, right?
I just know if it was like too much money, if that makes sense, like,
Yeah,
because it's just such a bigger scale, like you're saying, billions of dollars sometimes to get it to.
well, it takes big price increases for people to jump. So that's probably the interesting thing is that, 2 decades ago, we had to wait around for a price spike like the one that happened between 2008 and 2015 for Exxon to take on this drilling off the coast of Guyana because it was so deep, right? They didn't do it back. They knew the oil was there, but they didn't do it. But then when prices went up, they did it because they went up enough. They went from like $60 a barrel to 175 in a matter of 5 years. And they thought they were going to stay high, right? So it induced a lot of money in there to do big projects like that. Now it's different though. Fracking, if if 2 of you in this room can raise $1 million, I know it's a big ask of you, but if you could do it, you could go on frack. Okay, you could, if that's what you wanted to do. It's just so if you could have smaller enterprises entering that easily, then all of a sudden you can start to maybe camp down some of these price spikes, right? So as prices go up, more and more people are jumping in there at points along the road rather than waiting until they get up there and have a big person jump in, right? So it creates a different market dynamic, and people speculate that maybe those spikes will start to tamp down a little bit, but we don't know. I mean, it's a hypothesis. Yeah.
On this graph here, up until like 2003, and then like some other unique points where the blue is higher than the red, does that mean that you're like drifting into or surpassing the economically recoverable curve?
Well, yeah, so these are on 2 different scales, so you can't really compare the 2 things. Sorry about that. The the red one is on this side. And these actually are 2 different, this is barrels because they only put the proved reserves in barrels. And I put the production in millions of tons of oil equivalent. So they're actually 2 different scales. So you can't really infer anything from, other than the fact that they're kind of going the same direction at the same time. Okay, so where's this stuff happening in the US? The big things over here, the Bakken, huge, right? Anyone heard of that, North Dakota? Right, so a big chunk of the oil sector moved up there. They're not the biggest producer anymore, but I think for a time, like 2017, 18, 19, they probably were the biggest producer of oil in the US state. Texas followed by Texas. Kind of surprised that Texas got the second, I think, for a little bit short period of time. Texas is back on top, of course. Louisiana has always been big too because it got the offshore stuff in Louisiana. So this is the shale oil. The book has sort of an interesting discussion about the shale on the start of that. It's really interesting stuff on how this kind of got going. Has anyone been out there, West Texas? You been out, anyone? Never been out there? It's some good stuff. Do you guys want to go there? Sounds visible. Yeah. 60 people for the airline, please. Just kidding. I got, oops, I emailed myself some stuff. I gotta look at it. I can't remember coordinates in my head. Not sure why. Oh, hell, I can go find it myself. You guys, I love this mouse you got, Tom. This is great. Maps dot, is it Google Maps? Is it the Google that has the maps? Let's see. Where's Texas? Anyone know where Texas is? Oh, there's Texas. Is everything bigger in Texas? Yeah, it looks like it. Just gotta kind of get down a little closer. Oh, there it is. Look at all this crap. Beautiful. Beautiful. Isn't that beautiful? Look at all those frac pads. Isn't that awesome? Did you guys just love to live there? Go jump into that water. What do you think that water would be like to jump into? What do you think? And look at that. I mean, this is what's amazing about this place, is Permian Basin in West Texas. I mean, just spend some time on Google and try to find a place that doesn't have one of these frac pads on it. It's amazing. It's amazing how much they fracked out there. Now, all this is federal land. Not all of it. Most of it's like federal lands. These are all federal leases. A lot of it's BLM land. Not all of it, but a lot of it is. Now, before the fracking, and even now with the fracking, there would have been cattle grazing and stuff like that out there. So certainly it's more productive. You can see some of them are, got some crop circles. So that's kind of cool. Anyway, it's pretty interesting. There you go. You went to Texas. You feel good about that? You got fracking in Ohio too. I got some frac pads in Ohio. You guys, have you seen any frac pads in Ohio? I had to go find some. So just keep in mind this. There's a better place. Let me put this one on there. Now. It's good enough. That kind of gives you the picture, right? Look how much of that stuff there is. All right. And then I need a number pad over here. I think I'll have to email somebody and yell at them and ask them to do that. Does that work at Ohio State? If I email them and yell at them, do you think they'll do it for me?
Probably not.
Do you think they'll do it for me if I call them up and ask nicely? Probably not.
Combination of the two.
Yeah, not ever works. So there's a nice frac pad for you. I mean, it's a little different in Eastern Ohio. I mean, there are some places like right in here, right along 70, a few of them. Anyone from Eastern Ohio? Yeah. So you've seen some fracking pads?
Like Southeast.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, no.
There are some in Southeast Ohio. You're from Southwest Ohio?
Yeah.
There's no frac pads out there. No. These people are too rich to have frac pads in their backyard. Anyways, just to give you an idea, it's just, there's a lot of it in Ohio, and it's pretty big, but it's not near as big as in Texas. I mean, everything really is bigger in Texas. It just substantiates that. Honestly, the picture is just to show you how amazing it is out there, how much of this is happening, right? It's huge. Yeah.
Do you like frac pads, or they just like tax like you do small business, or they tax like specially? Like, is it like they pay like a higher tax for whatever amount of oil and stuff?
Oh, do they pay tax? Oh, great question. That is almost 100% determined by states, right? It's been a long discussion in Ohio about how much tax should be paid. So the businesses would certainly pay taxes, but in terms of the oil or gas that comes out of the ground, there's also a severance tax associated with that. Ohio has a really low severance tax. I forget what it is. Texas has pretty low one too. North Dakota has low. Most U.S. states have low severance taxes, actually. Explains in part why we have more extraction in most places per unit of reserve, right? Because we have a pretty low severance tax. Other places, governments view this as an opportunity to tax the heck out of a resource, right? And make some money on it, and then they'll sort of allocate the resource to the few people in government who can access the money. Yeah.
You said that land in Texas, federal land, is that right?
A lot of it, not all of it. So it's a lot of that out there is federal Bureau of Land Management.
How is it private organization, is that right? And then what are they doing with that? Right?
Well, so they have leases, they lease the land or lease the ability to drill there from the federal government. They'll pay a lease, an amount of money for that lease. That would be like the tax. It might be conditioned on them actually extracting the resource as well. So I don't know what the numbers are on that in terms of what the cost of the lease are. I can look those up, try to figure some of that out.
I was just curious, like, how the world is leasing that to have companies and taking the monies for they're not talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, so the US, even the federal government, where we have leases on federal land, even those lease rates are relatively low compared to lots of other places, actually. So, yeah, so in the US, we have, and we'll talk about this actually later. The US, the proportion energy is of the US economy is extremely small, actually, compared to lots of other places. So even though we're energy dependent, the contribution of it to our gross domestic product is actually relatively modest. So in that context, taxes you can get from that sector would not be that big to really fund a huge sovereign wealth fund, actually. You know, there's been virtually no discussion of doing that in the US, mainly because we're in just a completely different budget situation. But it also may not work as well here because it's actually a small proportion of the total tax base, actually. However, having said that, one can imagine, and this is why a lot of people in the US worry a lot less about the debt deficit than say people in other countries do. One reason is because it's denominated in US dollars and we get to print those dollars. So that's a nice choice to have. The second reason is because we have a lot of resources, right? So not only, and we have an enormous amount of federal land that we could always sell off if we wanted to. And it would easily recoup the 26 or 28 trillion dollars actually. And that land would definitely be worth that much money. Right, with all the oil under it, all the natural gas under it, and all the trees on it, all the grazing rights. So, you know, not to say you shouldn't worry about the debt, but we also, there's a pretty nice asset side of the balance sheet, right? Not that we want to do it, right, because we want to leave a lot of that oil in the ground in order to avoid climate change, but nonetheless, if we had to, if we were pressed, we could get rid of it. Okay, so that was just some of the highlights of that. How do I get back there? All right, there's 4,000 more slides, which I'm all going to do in a half a second. So this is amazing. I do recommend. I recommend to every person to drive west someday, even though you're using oil. It's worth it socially, culturally, and environmentally because you get to go through some amazing territories you haven't done it yet. But you know, North Dakota, you know, it was never on the map. But once they started extracting oil and natural gas, it's kind of like fracturing. I mean, what is it like New York City up there? It's pretty amazing stuff. I drug my family. We got on the Amtrak train and went across there in the middle of winter. So you got a lot of nighttime up in North Dakota. And it's not like it's not even nighttime. You see just these flames all over the place. It's pretty phenomenal. I mean, none of it's good necessarily for the environment, but it's pretty phenomenal. So there's the US. It was once in the 60s, top producer, kind of fell off, got all the way down to number 4 in 2005, number 3 in 2005, but back up on top in 2020, 2019, 2020. And you see Canada's kind of come up. Brazil's kind of jumped into the picture recently because of these really deep water finds they've had off the coast of Brazil. But most of this is in the Middle East. You know, China actually has a decent size reserves individually as a country. But that's relatively modest compared to what they actually produce. Okay. All right. A couple other things on oil. I got a couple more minutes on. Do just a couple other things on oil, and we'll do the other ones next week. Is the U.S. energy independent? Fascinating. We actually are. We're driven, and this is across all energy sources, not just oil. Right? We became oil independent in like 2017 or something like that, but now we're completely energy independent as of the pandemic, which is kind of interesting. And that's a function of two things. Obviously, an increase in production, in particular, is an increase in natural gas and oil production as a result of hydraulic fracturing, but also a function of the reduction in consumption that happened as a result of the pandemic. So the last thing is trade. Yeah.
Sorry, about the independence, do you expect us to like not be independent in the next few years as like maybe the effects of the pandemic wear off? Like was the decrease in consumption, if it's so tied to the pandemic, like do you expect it to shoot back up once things recover?
Yeah, no, I expect the US is probably on a course to being energy independent for a long time to come, actually, just because of renewables, actually. So between natural gas and renewables, it would be a travesty if we weren't able to maintain energy independence. That would be, you know. Now, there may be economic reasons I haven't thought through yet, but I would see that as being something we should be able to do. Yeah.
When we say energy independent, what specifically does that mean? For instance, I'm sure a lot of our exports take a lot of energy and they're probably not counted into that equation.
Yeah, that's correct. So that's just in direct energy consumption and production. So direct, right? Not indirect through products. That's a really good point. That's a great point. So, you know, we consume, we are not, so although we are energy independent, so in terms of tons of energy, we directly produce more than we consume. In terms of the products that we import into the country, we obviously import a lot more than we export. In terms of overall products, this is everything, right? So that's a really good point. And sort of along those lines, being energy independent means that, you know, if you just look at these trade movements, you know, and this is just for oil, actually. And remember, we're also oil independent. So we actually export oil and import oil sometimes from the same countries, right? So, and the point is there is that, you know, different, and we talked a little bit about this the other day, you know, we have a particularly good technologies for dealing with heavy oils. So we'll oftentimes import those. Fracking produces sweet light crude, which gets exported actually, right? That's a recent phenomenon in the US, because it used to be illegal up till about 2 years ago, but now we do export it. Anyways, we'll come back to this on Tuesday, in particular, talk about the other energy sources, just a little bit more on that, and we'll talk about demand. All right, you guys are great. If anyone's in the embedded honors class, can you just come up here for just a second, really quickly. How's it going?
Yeah, how are you?
Good, what's your name?
Kaya.
Okay, Kaya, cool. Okay, you're okay after class. But I don't want to get this thing, I have to come back over here and bother the next person.
I kind of.
Yeah.